sports event. They're familiar with Kingsland Railway Station. That's only going to improve when we have CRL into Kingsland and light rail arguably down Sandringham Road. But we're encouraging people. Gates open from 4 o'clock, and we've got 20 food and beverage outlets on the outer oval. We've got 67 food and beverage outlets within the facility. Our team has just been relentless in the planning. And we've been I had the Mayor down here today, and he looked genuinely excited about the prospect of these types of events happening in Auckland.
Nick, all the best for tomorrow, and thank you for being with us on the panel.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the time.
That is CEO Eden Park, Nick Sautner there.
50,000.
Quite amazing, eh? So 4 p.m. gates open, Maimoa 4:30, Jess B 4:55, Troy King in the Clutch at 5:35, Sir Dave Dobbin at 6:20, Drax Project 7:20 and 6:60 at 8:30 p.m. The concert will end at 10:30 p.m. So the good residents of Mount Eden can have a good night's sleep in a cocoa. And to you have a great long weekend. And to my wonderful producer, Amelia Langsford, thank you for putting the week together. Nick, Pax Sadi and Sally Winley, thank you very much. I'm Wallace Chapman.
Thank you, Wallace.
See you Tuesday. Bye.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Here, Haere nei, the door opens again for returnees from India, but only if you're a New Zealand citizen. The government singles out very high-risk COVID countries and introduces new MIQ rules in a bid to slash imported cases of the virus. But will other New Zealand residents be left stranded as the routes home narrow? Prescriptions for antidepressants are at a 4-year high. The abuse interstate care inquiry is cut drastically short, and disruption from the bus strike in Wellington could roll on for weeks to come. Thousands of Kauri trees in the Waitakere Ranges get a full health check, and time to spy on the spies. The spooks have joined Instagram.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. I'm Marama Tipole. New Zealand residents will be barred from returning from countries deemed very high risk because of the high rate of COVID-19 cases coming across the border. Only citizens, their partners and children, plus parents of citizens, will be allowed in from India, Pakistan, Brazil and Papua New Guinea. Sarah Robson reports.
Countries will be deemed very high risk if there have been more than 50 cases per 1,000 arrivals from them this year, and there are more than 15 travellers on average per month. From India, this is expected to reduce the number of potential positive cases at the border by about 75%. Residents will only be allowed in from very high-risk countries if they spend 14 days in another country before flying to New Zealand. Ko Sarah Robson, Aho.
Indian Workers Association coordinator Mandeep Bella says today's announcement is understandable, but he is still concerned about some people stuck in India.
Our heart goes out to not only residents but also the visa holders who actually were in New Zealand and now stranded offshore for over a year now. And at the same time, you can understand the government is trying to protect everybody in New Zealand as well.
Mandeep Bella says he's getting a lot of messages from distressed New Zealand residents and visa holders overseas. In another change announced today, people returning to New Zealand at about the same time will now all be taken to the same managed isolation hotel. The government is changing the way it handles MIQ to reduce the risk of COVID-19 transmission within facilities. Under the new system, cohorts of people arriving in New Zealand over a 96-hour period will be taken to the same MIQ facilities. Once they're full, or the 96-hour period is over, they'll be locked down for 14 days and no more returnees will be let in until the last of the cohort has left and the hotels have been cleaned. India has recorded the world's highest daily number of coronavirus cases for the second day in a row and a record number of daily deaths from COVID-19. With nearly 333,000 new cases in 24 hours, India's total caseload has now passed 16 million. The number of deaths rose by 2,263 to reach a total of just under 187,000, according to Health Ministry data. If New Zealand were experiencing the same rate of infection per capita. It would have had 1,200 new cases today. In fact, there were none. The National Party is supporting a review of local government while expressing reservations about the risk of power being taken away from ratepayers. The government today announced a 2-year independent review of every aspect of local government. National's local government spokesperson Christopher Luxon says he doesn't want it to be an excuse for centralisation.
This government, I think, is increasingly taking a we know best, Wellington knows best, and sort of building central bureaucracy. And we've seen that whether it's charter schools or polytechnics, DHBs, and I don't think that's appropriate that we go down that road with local government.
Christopher Luxon says the current system is fundamentally broken and the review is timely. The chair of the Wellington Regional Council says he's frustrated and disappointed by a bus operator's decision to lock out drivers. Drivers who belong to the Tramways Union went on strike today until tomorrow morning. In response, NZ Bus locked them out. Darren Ponta says he was incredibly annoyed when he found out.
I think there were a few expletives there and just extreme frustration and disappointment that large corporates in New Zealand are starting to revert to that sort of behaviour. Quite unnecessary, quite disproportionate to the circumstances.
The union says it won't engage in mediation until the lockout is ended. It's 5:04. In sports, Silver Ferns captain Amelia-Ann Ekenasio is back training with the Pulse, indicating a return to play may not be far off. Last week she said she was taking time out and would miss the start of the ANZ Premiership season because of fatigue. Although she's back with the squad, Pulse coach Gail Parata says they don't know when she'll be available to play.
We just get taking it day by day. Amelia-Ann has come back into the fold and working really closely with our physio and our trainer and also the Silver Fern management as well. Yeah, we'll see how she goes, but it is a day-by-day process for Amelia-Ann.
The Pulse, who lost their opening premiership match to the Northern Stars, play the Magic in Hamilton this weekend. The Blues have made a couple of changes to their backline for Sunday's Super Rugby game against the Crusaders, with Harry Plummer starting at first 5 and Danielu Telea outside him. With Patrick Tuipolotu and Tom Robinson both injured, Reiko Ioane and Dalton Papali'i will co-captain the team. Meanwhile, the Chiefs can close in on a place in the final if they can score a comprehensive win over the bottom-placed Hurricanes in Hamilton tonight. A week after winning her first LPGA event in 3 years, Lydia Ko has missed the cut at the LA Open. Though she improved sharply on her opening round 78 with a 3-under par 68, she missed out by 2 strokes. Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Saturday. In the west from Northland to Taranaki, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Rain spreading southeast today with some possible thunderstorms. Showers tomorrow, Whanganui to Wellington, cloudy. Rain tonight turning to showers tomorrow morning, but becoming fine in Wellington. Gisborne to Wairarapa, fine, but rain developing tomorrow morning with possible thunderstorms about Gisborne, then clearing south of Mahia by the afternoon. Marlborough and Nelson, rain, heavy and possibly thundery west of Takaka, spreading east this afternoon. Cloudy periods tomorrow. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, rain with heavy falls and possible thunderstorms turning to showers tomorrow, some heavy. Canterbury, Central Otago, North Otago and Dunedin, high cloud, a few showers developing tomorrow. Clutha and Southland, scattered rain today, showers tomorrow. And the Chatham Islands, fine spells, rain developing tomorrow morning. I'll have headlines at 5:30. Good afternoon.
Kia ora rā e hoa. Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint e tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. New, tougher border restrictions are expected to slash the number of potential COVID-positive cases from India alone by 75%. The government's classified it as a very high-risk country, along with Pakistan, PNG and Brazil, based on the number of people with COVID arriving in New Zealand from each of the hotspots. The new classification means only New Zealand citizens, their partners, children and parents of children who are New Zealand citizens will be able to travel directly from very high-risk countries to Aotearoa. Anyone else, including permanent residents, must have been outside the newly classified countries for at least 14 days before travelling to New Zealand. The new category comes into force at 11:59pm, April 28th, and other countries will be added to the list if their rate of COVID cases is more than 50 per 1,000 returnees. Now, the government's also changing the way MIQ operates by grouping returnees. Travellers arriving in New Zealand within a 96-hour window will go to the same hotel until that hotel fills up or the clock runs down on the 96 hours. The hotel is then locked down, no more new guests, until the very last person in that cohort finishes their isolation. COVID Response Minister Chris Hipkins says the groupings are based on time of arrival, not country of origin or flight.
It'll reflect the planes that they've come in on. So basically the idea is that you start with an empty facility. Over 92 hours you have plane loads of people all being transported to the same facility, either at the end of the 96 hours or once the facility is full. That gets effectively locked down for a 2-week period. We have to recognise that the country of origin isn't necessarily the best and only marker of risk for this particular purpose, because people are often interacting in transit and on the plane on the way to New Zealand.
But to be clear, you could have people arriving from India going into the same hotel as people arriving from the UK, even though those countries have different classifications.
We would certainly be trying to make sure that very high risk and high risk as much as practical are being kept separate, but bearing in mind that those coming from very high-risk countries will be arriving on the same plane as people coming from high-risk countries. So to some extent, that's beyond our control.
Not always, though. So there is an element of mixing and matching in your cohort in terms of the risk classification of the countries.
Well, if you look at where the majority of our very high-risk country passengers are coming at the moment, they're coming through the United Arab Emirates on a particular flight. That flight also has people from Europe and from all around the rest of the world as well.
So in terms of people who are not New Zealand citizens, who have rights to reside here in New Zealand, is it your expectation that they will have to exit a high-risk country, pay for 2 weeks accommodation somewhere else, and then you'll allow them into New Zealand?
That's right. So we haven't said, we have to provide a pathway for New Zealanders to come back. We've always been very clear, other than where there's a very short-term reason to put a restriction in place, we would not restrict the right of New Zealanders to return home. A permanent resident, of course, has somewhere else that is their where they are a citizen. But if they do wish to come back to New Zealand, then they can do that, but they have to spend 2 weeks somewhere else first.
How many people are in that category as far as you know?
As I indicated before, in terms of the overall arrivals from India, which is the largest group affected by this at the moment, around 75% of the overall number coming in would be affected, of our positive cases would be affected by this. So it would be a reasonably significant number of people. We've been receiving...
Sorry, Minister, just to clarify that, are you saying 75% of the people who would have been coming in on planes from India can now no longer come?
Sorry, that's positive cases that we're reducing there. In terms of the numbers, I think we've been receiving from India around 450 a month, roughly, coming in from India. So it's possible that a reasonable proportion of those were permanent residents and so on. So we are talking about hundreds of people that could be affected by this.
You've previously said some of our MIQs are not up to very high risk arrivals. So which ones are suitable for your cohorting?
Look, the vast majority of them are. What we are looking...
Okay, so tell me the ones that aren't then, if that's the shorter list.
Look, there's negotiations going on with those particular facilities, and so I don't want to...
Why not? It's a matter of public interest. If you're a returnee, it's luck of the draw whether you get a good hotel that is fitted out with the best equipment, the best ventilation system. You know, some hotels have higher risks, so tell us the ones that you don't think are up to very high risk returnees.
Yeah, I'm not going to do that today. Ultimately, there are some who would cope with a higher concentration of higher risk returnees better than others. And there's a variety of factors, including how much physical space they have in them, the ventilation systems that are within them, the transport arrangements to and from them, the arrangements around exercise areas and so on. But I'm not going to release all of that today while we're in negotiations with those hotels.
When will you release it?
Look, once we've confirmed what that's going to look like, once we've got contracts, once we've determined whether any of those facilities are going to be repurposed or released from the system, then we'd certainly...
But what is your time frame to do that, Minister?
Look, it's happening at the moment.
But you say you've got a legal responsibility for returnees, right? So bearing that legal responsibility in mind, wouldn't the lowest risk option be to cohort people according to the flights that they came in on?
Well, that's exactly what we're doing, so that they will...
But not entirely. You're mixing
There could be
arrivals
several
from
flights in one
different
facility,
flights.
that's correct. One of the challenges that we have at the moment is, in an ideal world we would have the same number of people, the same number of flights, same number of people arriving each day, every day, over a period of time, and you could manage, cohorts much more easily. The reality is that the number of arrivals from red zone countries can vary hugely, from a couple of dozen in a day to a couple of hundred in a day, and so we have to have a system that allows for that.
If the UAE flight is one of the highest risk flights, as you have identified, why not put a cap on the number of flights you will accept from that, on that particular route?
It's not so much about the number of flights, it's about the number of people, and bearing in mind that the high concentration of those people, a high concentration of the risk on that particular flight has been people who have been coming from India. If we were to simply reduce the number of flights from the UAE, then those people could potentially be transiting through a different country instead, and it wouldn't necessarily reduce
You'd limit their
overall
options
risk.
though, wouldn't you? And likely that would limit
We're
the
already
number.
limiting the options significantly through the travel restriction that I've just announced.
So what legal advice have you had about your obligations, your legal obligations to permanent residents who are sort of being rerouted through other countries if they want to come back here?
So ultimately we must, under international conventions, allow citizens to return to New Zealand, so we don't create people who are stateless. As I've indicated before, if someone is a resident or even a permanent resident, then they have another country of citizenship.
What consideration have you given to the fact that you may be putting their lives at risk?
We absolutely acknowledge that for those who are in a country where COVID-19 is spreading rapidly, there are a lot of people who would far rather be somewhere else in the world at the moment.
And they do have the right to come here. They have the paperwork.
I acknowledge that this is a difficult decision for them.
And that was COVID Response Minister Chris Hipkins there. India is being ravaged by a second wave of COVID-19, accelerating beyond anywhere else in the world. In the past 24 hours, more than 2,000 people have died and more than 300,000 cases have been reported. The true figures, though, are thought to be much higher. Across India, including the capital Delhi, cities are on the edge of disaster as hospitals are overwhelmed and people die without the treatment they need. The BBC's Yogita Lamai reports.
I'm outside the GTB hospital in eastern Delhi, which is one of the big public hospitals in this city. And what I can see outside the emergency room door is a crowd of people. Some of them have stretchers. They're trying to get these patients who are COVID positive admitted into the hospital, but hospital authorities are saying that it is full and they can't take these patients in. I've spoken to one woman who's brought in both her mother and her father here. Her father's oxygen levels are extremely low. I can see him. He's lying on the stretcher. He's looking very ill. She's trying to fan him with a piece of paper because it is also very hot outside. Basically, people desperate to try to get their loved ones, their family members, into a hospital facility, but they're unable to do so here.
The capital of India has been brought to its knees by COVID-19. People are being pushed to the limit of human endurance. So please come and look at my mother. One man pleaded through the crowd at the door of the emergency room. The doctor followed him to the ambulance in which his mother lay, but she'd already died. Why are you lying like this? Wake up, a woman said as she tried to revive her brother, who was lying on a stretcher, slipping into unconsciousness. Balaji Tirupati died a few minutes later. He was the father of 2 children. COVID-19 has hit India with a ferocity not seen before, but not unexpected either. This is the situation many feared India would end up in when the pandemic began. Hospitals struggled during the first wave too, but it wasn't this severe. And when it ended, the government almost declared victory over COVID-19. This country was caught unprepared. And it's not just hospital beds that are falling short, but oxygen supplies too. Om Prakash told us his wife died because the oxygen cylinder in the ambulance became empty while he was on his way to a third hospital to try to get her treated. Delhi has been stunned by fear and grief.
I'm at a crematorium in Ghaziabad, just on the outskirts of Delhi, and as I am walking in, I can see a queue of ambulances, people waiting for the funeral of their loved ones. To the right, I can see 4 funeral pyres burning. To the left, I can see there's a huge log of woods. I was speaking to an ambulance driver as I came in who said he's never seen such a bad situation in his life. He said for the past week he's working virtually non-stop, and even then people have been waiting for hours, sometimes days, to say goodbye to their loved ones. And as I'm standing here, I can now see in front of me a man just about to light the pyre of a loved one.
And that report from Yogita Lamai in Delhi. It is almost 19 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Still to come on the program, prescriptions for antidepressants are at a 4-year high. Well, it's pretty slow going heading out of Auckland tonight ahead of the long weekend. And our reporter Louise Tanous is on a motorway overbridge in central Auckland. Louise, tell us, how is it looking?
Yeah, hi Lisa, I'm at the Wellington Street overbridge and just behind me is the Southern Motorway moving out of the city, and I can tell you now it is very backed up. Now the traffic around me is severely building up. Let's remember again that the school holidays are also on, so it's a super busy time, and Anzac Day falls into that long weekend as well with those school holidays. I checked just recently and it was about 2 hours from Albany to the city, and for those holiday destinations like Coromandel and Whangamata, you're looking at 3 to 4 hours plus.
Wow, and the weather's not helping, Louise. Who's the mean producer who sent you out on a night like tonight? Hey, what is the advice that Waka
Lisa, when the rain comes, people kind of forget to drive.
Yeah, and looking at the cars over your shoulder, they are moving pretty slowly. So what advice is Waka Kotahi giving motorists?
Yeah, so Waka Kotahi has basically said that the heavy traffic is inevitable. It is a long weekend, but they're urging motorists to plan ahead. So the key to that is trying to find an off-peak time. So peak traffic coming out of Auckland was from about 12 p.m. today it started, and they're expecting that to run until 8 tonight. It's the same sort of situation tomorrow for Saturday, about 10:30 till about 3 p.m. Try and avoid that time if you can, but they're urging people to use the online journey planner to see just how long things will take. And they've also stopped most roadworks heading around the Northland region to try and reduce those times. But basically the advice is just try and find an off-peak time, and good luck to everyone who's travelling out of Auckland for this long weekend.
Kia ora rā, e ho. Go find somewhere dry, Louise. Thanks so much. Louise Tanous there in central Auckland, and the traffic is moving pretty slowly, as she said there. Homai o whakaro, if you are in a safe place, do get in touch. Text us, because we want to know what the traffic is like where you are, but get the passenger to do it, eh? You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. The government has made drastic changes to the Royal Commission into Abuse in Care's inquiry, meaning abuse that's happened over the last 22 years can no longer be investigated. The inquiry is examining abuse of people in state and faith-based care between 1950 and 1999. But it was also given discretion to look outside of that period of time. The Internal Affairs Minister, Jan Tinetti, has now removed this power. But survivor advocates say the change is dreadful, short-sighted, and they want the government to reverse its decision. Here's political reporter Katie Scotcher.
It's already the biggest royal commission in New Zealand's history, investigating decades of traumatic abuse in state and faith-based care over 5 years. But the inquiry wants to be even bigger, asking the government for a 2.5-year extension.
The work was a lot more complex and larger than what they anticipated. To be able to hear all of the evidence in depth, they felt that an extension was needed.
The government has instead given it an extra 5 months, meaning it will hand in its final report by June 2023. And to ease the inquiry's workload, Internal Affairs Minister Jan Tinetti has taken the significant step of narrowing its scope. She's removed its power to investigate modern-day care providers and recent cases of abuse. Abuse survivor Keith Whiffen says he's uncomfortable about the changes.
It will come as a great shock to many survivors because the two biggest things that survivors want from this process is acknowledgement and recognition as to what's happened historically to them and others, and to know that what happened to them is not going to happen to those who are in care now and who will go into care in the future. And that is exactly what seems to be undermined here.
Lawyer Sonia Cooper represents roughly 1,400 abuse survivors. She says there's no way the Royal Commission can hand over a credible report if it doesn't consider the abuse happening now.
One of its key tasks was to make recommendations about improving our system so that those who are currently in care don't suffer the same fate. Well, if we don't know what currently in care are experiencing, if we kind of blind the Royal Commission from being able to look at what's happening now, then we also thwart their ability to make realistic recommendations about making it better.
Ms Cooper says for the government to justify its decision by saying there are current investigations underway isn't credible either.
Those are discrete inquiries and they are only into Oranga Tamariki, whereas the inquiry is looking at residential and state schools, it's looking at faith-based organisations, it's looking at forestals, and it's looking at psychiatric hospitals. They're not even touched on.
But another abuse survivor, Tyrone Marks, says before you look into the future, you have to understand the past.
If you read a book, you don't start halfway through it and then get to the end without investigating what happened in the beginning or where the story actually comes from first. You know, what happened yesterday has a big impact and a big bearing on what is happening today.
The government has also moved forward the due date for the Royal Commission's report on redress. Jan Tinetti says this is because ministers want to take it to Budget 2022 negotiations. Liz Tonks from the Catholic Survivors Network says many want the inquiry to end there.
We know that people are not reporting to the Commission. They have lost trust in it because of the legalist way it's been run, the lack of contact they've had with it post-reporting.
A spokesperson for the Royal Commission says it will speak with the Internal Affairs Minister to clarify the nature and extent of the changes and the implications for survivors and those currently in care. Antui te whare parimata mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Katie Scott Churaho.
New figures show the rate of antidepressants being prescribed over the past 4 years is at an all-time high, and there's a huge disparity between ethnic groups. Data released at Checkpoint under the Official Information Act shows the rate of antidepressants prescribed to Māori and Pasifika is up to 34 times less than other ethnicities. That's despite Māori and Pasifika having higher rates of mental health problems. Experts say the figures aren't surprising and highlight a broken system. Louise Tanuth reports.
The data from the Ministry of Health looks at the number of antidepressants prescribed from 2017 to 2020. On average, other ethnicities were given antidepressants at 8 times the rate of Māori, 34 times the rate of Pasifika, and 16 times the rate of Asians. But this doesn't marry up with research, which shows 1 in 3 Māori and 1 in 4 Pacific people experience mental illness compared to 1 in 5 for the total population, according to the latest mental health report from 2018. Associate Professor of Pacific Health at Auckland University, Colin Tukuitonga, says the disparity isn't surprising.
So cost is often a barrier, just logistics and the reality, not having transport, being at work and unable to go.
He says Pasifika people are often undiagnosed and undertreated for mental health due to cultural barriers.
There's a prevailing view that Pacific people particularly women, don't suffer depression or anxiety, or they're not supposed to suffer depression or anxiety. We know from several studies that Pacific Island people tend to present with a physical symptom such as a tummy ache, and often they would be treated for the tummy ache, but their actual problem is a underlying mental health disorder.
And a lack of training for GPs on how to discuss mental health and pick up on the signs in Pacifica pushes patients away.
They'll come once, they have an unpleasant experience, and then they just disappear and don't come back.
Co-head of Te Wānanga o Waipapa, School of Māori and Pacific Studies at the University of Auckland, Jemima Tiatia-Seith, says that points to institutional racism.
There is a lack of cultural competency. New Zealand is diversifying thick and fast, and yet the workforce isn't quite keeping up with that.
She wants primary care workers to receive more support to treat patients for mental health. And GPs are calling for it too.
There's a huge amount of work that has to be done here. I think we've still got a very, very fragmented system, very, very difficult, and there are large gaps. And I think for a lot of general practitioners, they feel a sense of frustration and isolation in terms of dealing with these issues often.
That's Dr. Brian Betty, Medical Director of the New Zealand College of GPs. He says GPs are often the first point of call for patients and they don't have the support they need from specialists.
You've got a moderately severe patient, you need some rapid advice of, say, a psychiatrist. You can't actually access that the way we've designed the system. It's actually very, very difficult to get. The patient needs to access a psychologist. There's a major shortage. Often it's very costly, and you're forced into a referral, and often the referrals are turned down because they don't reach thresholds, and that becomes really problematic.
The biggest jump came in 2020, when 21,721 more people than the year before were prescribed with antidepressants. CEO of the Mental Health Foundation, Sean Robinson, puts that down to COVID lockdowns and the pandemic's long-term effects. He says medication shouldn't be the only solution and is overprescribed to compensate for help that's lacking.
Medications are not the total answer, and they're not all of what people need. And in fact, sometimes they're used because the real thing that people need, which might be counselling or it might be assistance with dealing with their life situation, that those supports simply aren't available.
On average, females were prescribed antidepressants at nearly twice the rate of males. Sean Robinson says stigma is behind this.
Unfortunately, when it comes to, say, suicide, men are much more likely than women to actually go to the point of attempting or taking their own life. But our research and the research in the issue of suicide shows women are almost twice as likely as men to have an unhealthy well-being.
That's echoed by consultant psychiatrist Dr. Nicholas Ho from the Department of Psychological Medicine at Auckland University.
Gender norms around opening up about emotional distress, depression. Antidepressants are also used for anxiety disorders as well as OCD, and also for other things like abnormal eating, dysfunctional eating. Women are more likely to help seek and maybe also or receive. Prescriber may be more likely to ask and inquire around mental health.
The latest government inquiry into mental health from 2018 was released last month, finding some progress but frustration over the pace of change. A new independent mental health and wellbeing commission was established in response to this report, with goals to help improve the mental health system over the next decade. For Checkpoint, Louise Tenuth.
And a reminder of where to get help if you'd like to talk to someone. You can text or call 1737 for free anytime, or 0800 Lifeline. So those again, 1737 or 0800 Lifeline, and we'll put a full list of numbers up on our website. And coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, New Zealand citizens will be welcomed back from very high-risk COVID countries, but the routes home for permanent residents are narrowing and fast. So what are their rights? And Kauri trees in the Waitakere Ranges get a full health check. Homai o whakaaro, we would love to hear from you. You can text us on 2101, you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or Facebook us at Checkpoint, or the email address is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Marama is here with the headlines now.
Thank you, Lisa. RNZ News. New Zealand residents wanting to return here from very high-risk countries will have to spend at least 2 weeks in another country first. Under new COVID-19 border rules announced today, only citizens, their partners and children, and parents of citizens will be allowed into the country from India, Pakistan, Brazil and Papua New Guinea. Indian Workers Association coordinator Mandy Bella says the move is understandable, but he's still concerned about some people stuck in India. Meanwhile, India has recorded the world's highest daily number of cases for the second day in a row and a record number of daily deaths from COVID-19. With nearly 333,000 new cases in 24 hours, India's total caseload has now passed 16 million. The number of deaths rose by 2,263 to reach a total of just under 187,000, according to Health Ministry data. A Papatoetoe rest home has become the first aged care facility in Auckland to get its residents vaccinated against COVID-19. A team of vaccinators from the Northern Region Health Coordination Centre inoculated 38 residents and staff at the Kenderdine Park home today. The local government minister has announced a 2-year review into the future of local government. Nanaia Mahuta made the announcement this morning, saying the review will be chaired by the recently retired Chief Executive of the Waimakariri District Council, Jim Palmer. Ms Mahuta says the review will shape local government for at least the next 25 to 30 years. Holidaymakers leaving Auckland are facing delays on the roads both north and south of the city ahead of the long weekend. It's currently taking just under 2 hours for traffic heading south to Bombay on State Highway 1. Traffic is also congested north of the city to Wellsford with a current average travel time of 1 hour and 28 minutes. Waka Kotahi is advising drivers to allow extra time for their journeys, be patient and consider travelling outside of busy times to avoid congestion. Those are the headlines. Our next news and sport update is at 6.
Thanks, Marama. Those are some pretty gnarly travel times. No mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei, and it is time to get to the business news with Nicholas Poynton. Nicholas, let's talk about telcos, right? Lots of people like to complain about telcos. And apparently complaints are rising?
Yeah, the number of complaints about telcos in the past year are actually up 13%. You compare where they were about 4 years ago, they're up by a quarter since then, and that's according to information that's been gathered as part of the Disputes Regulation Scheme. Now, that was set up back in 2007. It's designed to be an independent process, a body that sort of facilitates complaints consumers may have about their telco provider. But that sudden rise in complaints we've seen over the past year, that's prompted the first ever review of the scheme. It will look at how the scheme has been working, whether it's covering the right issues, what players in the market it's covering, and they're going to look at how it's been run. And I think one of the interesting questions that's going to be asked as part of this review is the independence of this body. How independent is it, given that the industries is the one who funds it? Now, the Telecommunications Forum, that represents all the telcos in this country, they say that the review is a good thing. You know, these things can be improved over time, but it does say that while complaints are rising, they don't necessarily think that that means that the services that the telcos provide are getting worse. They're of the view that the rise in complaints is due to the fact that people rely on their devices more than ever, and because of that, they're more likely to have issues. And they also point to the fact that there's now more than 8 million telecommunications connections in this country. It's not just people's cell phones, it's also broadband, whatever else they have. And they say that 3,000...
Because you need it more. If it goes wrong, you're more likely to speak up.
It's going to cause so much more of a disruption, right? So you're going to be much more aggrieved if things do go wrong. But they say, look, 8 million connections, 3,000 complaints, you know, it's a pretty good strike rate in their opinion. They also point to the fact that 98% of complaints actually get resolved. So the results of this review will be published in November, and their findings are going to be quite interesting because, look, as I mentioned before, this was set up in 2007. The whole landscape of our telecommunications sector has changed since then. So it'll be interesting to see how they sort of adapt the rules, how they adapt the scheme to sort of meet these challenges.
Okay, we talked about this company yesterday, I think it was. The little company with big issues. Okay, so QEX, right? You were talking about how it was planning to delist, potentially, but what? There's another twist in the story?
Yeah, they've already hit a snag, another setback, and this is a company, the global logistics company, exports mainly animal products or baby formula to China. Look, they've experienced so many setbacks over the past 6 months, and this is just another one. Will remain to be seen how much of a setback it really is, I guess, because look, this company it had trading and its shares suspended back in February. That's because all its independent directors resigned, and since then it's been unable to find a replacement. They point to the fact that there's just been so much negative publicity surrounding the company, and that's prompted the company to lay out these plans to, as we mentioned yesterday, to delist, go private, and hopefully eventually sell this business. And they say that, in their opinion, the company, they reckon that this is in the best interest of shareholders, and they're waiting to put this to a vote to shareholders and get approval from the NZX to follow through on their plans. However, the Shareholders Association says delisting would be the worst possible outcome for shareholders, the polar opposite of what QEX is saying. They say because it believes the future of the company is best decided within the transparency and the accountability obligations that come with being a listed company. The fear here is that if the company goes private, the company would become even harder to sort of contact, and less forthcoming with the details of the situation that they currently find themselves in. So that's why the association says it's better if this company stays listed. It decreases the risk of even further losses to shareholders while this company's been suspended in this trading halt. So because of this, the association says it will vote its proxy shares against delisting. However, QEX's chief executive owns 70% of the company. So, the Shareholders Association taking the stance, not likely to really move things too much, but there's still so much more to come on this. It'll be really interesting to see how it all plays out. I feel like this won't be the last time we talk about this company.
Okay, well, let's do a quick whip around the markets then.
So the NZX, it closed up 73 points to 12,651, and the dollar is at 71.8 US cents and 92.8 Australian.
Thanks, Nicholas. Nicholas Poynton with Business. Non-New Zealand citizens trying to get back to Aotearoa from very high-risk COVID countries are basically out of runway under the government's new rules. It's created a category for countries with very high numbers of COVID cases among returnees. So far, India, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea and Brazil are on that list. In a bid to slash the number of positive COVID cases arriving here in New Zealand, from 11:59pm next Wednesday, only New Zealand citizens, their partners and children and parents of children who are New Zealand citizens will be allowed to fly home directly from countries that are in this new category. Anyone else, including permanent residents, will have to spend 14 days in another lower risk country before they can head here. So with the routes home narrowing, I asked Otago University law professor Andrew Geddes whether the new rules are effectively a ban for that group of people.
It is a ban insofar as they're not going to be allowed to enter into New Zealand while their countries remain on the red list, or they're designated as being red countries, as it were. It's possible for the government to do that because the right to enter into New Zealand is a right that's guaranteed only to New Zealand citizens under our Bill of Rights Act. And the government can't make COVID-19 orders that trench on those rights under the Bill of Rights Act. The right of residents to enter into New Zealand in the Immigration Act, that can be overridden by these COVID-19 orders, which is what the government's proposing to do.
In doing that, if you look at the route for those people to get here, right, the government has said, OK, you can still come, but you have to come from a country other than India, and you have to have been away from a very, very high-risk country, for example, for 14 days, so outside of that country. But if you look at all the rules of surrounding countries, it's very hard for someone to, lily pad here to New Zealand from somewhere else. So is it an effective ban when the one route you give them isn't really realistic?
Yes, I think that's a fair comment. There are theoretical avenues still open, but as you point out, in practice, those are going to be very difficult as well as extraordinarily expensive for people to be able to go through. So, while the designation of a country is that they are on the red list, only citizens or people who are parents of citizens or dependents of citizens will be allowed to come from that country to New Zealand. Everyone else, even if they're residents, even if they've lived here for an extended period of time as permanent residents, are basically being told, well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to stay in place until we think it's safe for you to come back home.
You mentioned immigration laws there. Is there any comeback for these people? I mean, as it stands, they've got the right paperwork, right? They're legally allowed to enter the country, but in essence cannot. So do they have any comeback at all?
Well, so under the Immigration Act, they would have the right to come into the country if they got to the border. But the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act that was passed last year has a provision in it that says orders under this Act basically trump any other piece of legislation except for the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. So if the government uses its powers under the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act, which it will do, to say, I'm sorry, only New Zealand citizens can come into the country because they're allowed to under the Bill of Rights Act, then that order will take legal precedence over the Immigration Act. The only way to challenge would be to say that the order itself is somehow disproportionate. It's too great a measure given the risk that such people pose. And I think what the government's tried to do is say, well, we're only going to designate a country as being a red country, a risk country, if there are these, really high numbers of people coming from there. So the government, I think, will feel it's on fairly safe grounds with being able to show that the risk is great enough to justify the order.
The Minister says they're working on humanitarian exemptions, right? If we can just use India as an example, where there are very high case numbers there, and we've seen the reports of hospitals running out of oxygen, people unable to get treatment. If they're talking about humanitarian exemptions, is it enough for someone to say, well, if you leave me in this country, I could die because I can't access the care I need should I get COVID-19?
Well, I suspect not, because otherwise everyone in India would try to make use of that avenue. The humanitarian exceptions that we've basically seen have been already in the law, have been, in terms of getting into MIQ more quickly, have been if there's something in New Zealand you need to get to really quickly, or if you're in some extraordinary situation in your home country that sets you aside from anyone else. I suspect they won't say that the mere risk of getting COVID and the result of getting COVID in India is enough to meet the grounds. Otherwise, as I say, everyone will try to use that loophole to get in.
How long is the government able to maintain this regime? Indefinitely?
As long as a country meets their criteria to be on the red list, then from a legal perspective, there wouldn't really seem to be any problem. Now, I guess if it lasted for, let's just say a year and a half, you could argue that was lasting for so long it became a disproportionate type of response. But certainly in the near to medium future, provided they've set the threshold adequately to justify making the order, then, as I say, one of the things when Parliament passed that COVID-19 Public Health Response Act is it gave the executive government an extraordinary amount of power, and we're seeing just how much power that was.
Presumably then, in terms of setting the legal basis to get on the very high risk list, right, that places all these restrictions on you, they must therefore, legally be required to lay out a path for you to exit that list as a country?
Well, I would say so. The way they've done it is that if a country has people coming from the country, more than 50 out of 1,000 of such people have COVID, and they're sending more than 15 people, I think, per week or whatever it is, to New Zealand.
Yeah, per month, yep.
Per month, then that gets you on the red list as a country. Once a country stops meeting that criteria, well, then there'd be no reason to keep it on the red list. It would, come off it, and these restrictions would come off. But the way that they've announced the policy, as long as the country meets those criteria, it stays on the red list, and these rules will apply, which means people whose home is in New Zealand and may have lived here for years and years and years are being told, essentially, sorry, there's no place for you here yet. You'll have to stay in that other country, and good luck.
And while some people might find that distasteful, it's not illegal.
As I say, when the law was written last year to give the government extreme and wide-ranging powers, this was the sort of thing our Parliament authorised.
In terms of the citizens, right, the door is back open for them. They can come back in, but again, with them, there's just been a notification from the UAE that's suspending all passenger flights from India from tomorrow, right? They will only carry passengers who've been outside of India for 14 days. So these are citizens. They are also potentially going to be caught by more countries closing up avenues for departure from India. Is there any obligation on the government to offer some kind of assistance, seeing as they previously closed the window for them altogether?
It's interesting. To be honest, I don't know from a legal perspective. That may go into the more sort of moral political realm. I mean, these are our people that we've left over in India and told them just wait there for a bit while we sort the problem out. Now, we think we've sorted the problem out, but in the meantime, you've lost your opportunity to come home. Does that put a moral obligation on the government to hire some planes, fly over to India to get our people and bring them home? I would be very sympathetic to that argument.
So, from a purely legal point of view, Andrew, is this a well-finessed fix?
I think it is. I mean, I think it avoids the main problem that the government has, which is the obligations under the Bill of Rights Act and also under international law not to close your borders off to your people, your citizens. So by exempting citizens from it, they avoid the main legal fishhook. Everything else thereafter is legally doable simply because Parliament gave such extreme powers to the executive branch under that legislation last year. Whether that power has been used appropriately or not then becomes a political, moral question rather than a legal question.
And that is Otago University law professor Andrew Geddes. And some of you have been getting in touch about this. One listener says, I'm a 9-year permanent resident. I can't believe the government's now locking us out. If we have to go home quickly, I have no other home. And Peter says, which country will accept people for 2 weeks when they will not be accepted by New Zealand, which is obviously the point that we were discussing. And just a public service thing here. Another listener's got in touch. We're talking about travel, so we might as well address this one. And they're saying, if you're heading to Auckland Airport, take the bus. They say they're just arriving at the airport, left 40 minutes ago, which is not bad given that traffic is an absolute standstill, followed by a few exclamation marks. So a word of warning there to you. It is 12 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. And after 6 tonight, MIQ is getting a shake-up as well, but does it go far enough? UK politicians have slammed New Zealand's response to China's policies and alleged human rights abuses against the Uyghur minority. It comes as the UK declares it genocide and crimes against humanity. World Watch's Paulina Lau has more.
A UK politician with stern words for New Zealand over its response to China's policies against the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. China is accused of detaining up to 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps, and there have been reports of systematic rape, abuse and forced sterilisation. Allegations Beijing denies. Today, the UK says it amounts to genocide and crimes against humanity. Speaking in Parliament today, Tory MP Bob Seeley says China dominates the UK supply chain, but the country needs to limit its dependence on China.
If we go further down that route, we end up like New Zealand, in a hell of an ethical mess, of a Prime Minister who virtue signals whilst crudely sucking up to China, whilst backing out of the Five Eyes Agreement, which I think is an appallingly short-sighted thing to be doing.
UK MPs have also expressed concern over what they consider to be New Zealand's opposition to expanding the scope of the Five Eyes alliance beyond intelligence sharing. Foreign Affairs Minister Nanaia Mahuta made these comments yesterday.
We do value the Five Eyes relationship, but whether or not that framework needs to be invoked every time on every issue, especially in the human rights space, is something that we have expressed further views about.
Australia has been vocal about Xinjiang and has called for a UN inquiry into Uyghur internment, further deteriorating its relationship with China. Mr Seeley says the UK needs to stand alongside Australia and make sure the UK's values aren't tradable.
We need to be standing shoulder to shoulder with Australia. I think it's a bit of a tired cliche being shoulder to shoulder with people, but the Australians are calling out China and they're doing it at trade risk. We need to make sure they do not pay an ethical price.
Prominent Brexiteer Nigel Farage says New Zealand has sold its soul to China.
But the Five Eyes increasingly have been worried about the rise of China, about Chinese military activity in the South China Seas and elsewhere. So the absolutely shocking, stunning statement that has come from the New Zealand Foreign Minister, backed up by the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, that effectively they are launching a new close alliance with China, and they are effectively leaving the Five Eyes intelligence network. We have just lost one of our closest and oldest allies in the world because they're now completely in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. New Zealand have sold their souls.
Jacinda Ardern said in March she would continue raising concerns with China over the treatment of Uyghur people, and that if there's a concern, it's raised directly. Last month, the UK, United States, the EU and Canada launched sanctions against Chinese officials over the Uyghur issue, which prompted swift retaliation from Beijing. For Checkpoint, Perlina Lau.
It was a noisy wake-up call for a few Wellington residents this morning as bus drivers on strike started the picket line well before sunrise in one of the capital's suburbs. Chants, car horns and a brass band were all go for the 24-hour strike, due to end at 4 tomorrow morning. But service disruptions could last a lot longer after the employer, NZ Bus, decided to lock out the drivers indefinitely once the strike ends. Our reporter Harry Locke and cameraman Dom Thomas went to check out the disruption.
It was an early start for the picketers.
Hey, bus drivers are under attack! Stand up, fight back! Stand up.
By 6 a.m, about 30 of them had gathered outside of Kilbirnie Depot. Spurring them on was nearly every car driving past, responding to a placard which read "Toot to show your support."
We've put up with this for too long, and that's what it's come to. Hey, that's what it's come to.
There was a sense of excited tension in the air, with the strike running for 24 hours until Saturday. One driver, Rafael Ioani, says the strike has been some time coming.
All the members are all good and supportive to each other. You know, we've been fighting for this for a long time. And, it's about time for us to stand up and do some, some fight for our fair pay.
But there was also frustration at the actions of their employer, NZ Bus, who yesterday took the decision to lock out the drivers once the strikes end. Driver Michael Folks says he's now in limbo.
Because I'm supposed to work on Sunday, so I don't suppose I'll be there. See what happens. Yeah, it's a shame. There's a lot of people who put up with a lot of rubbish from this company.
Drivers were joined by supporters at the picket line. Members of other unions, and indeed a union band, lent the strike a raucous atmosphere. The strikes are affecting 26 routes across the city, predominantly hitting the eastern and western suburbs the most, as well as Eastbourne in Lower Hutt. But gridlock mostly absent. It's a strange sight to see Courtney Place at 8 o'clock in the morning, so quiet without so many buses. But not all services were cancelled, meaning rush hour actually wasn't as bad as it possibly could have been. The question is now what happens next. With the strike due to end at 4 o'clock tomorrow morning, the lockout will then begin. Secretary of the Wellington branch of the Tramways Union, Kevin O'Sullivan, says there is now a lot of uncertainty.
That will certainly put the pressure on Next Capital and NZ Bus. Not good for the members, though, who obviously want to come to work and earn a living. So we'll just have to play it by ear and see what happens.
A mediation process was due to begin between the union and the company on Tuesday, but O'Sullivan says they won't engage until the lockout ends. Meanwhile, Chair of the Regional Council, which oversee the public transport network, Darren Ponter, wants to see both sides come together.
At some point, the adults in the room have to get back in the room. We just can't have this situation where we're bashing Wellingtonians around the head with strike action and lockouts.
But he thinks the city's residents are firmly on the side of the drivers.
Wellingtonians hold their public transport system much closer to their heart. If something goes on the Wellington transport system, I get to know it personally from Wellingtonians.
There are also fears the lockout will make it more difficult for people affected by the cancellations to get to Anzac Day events on Sunday. I te whanganui atara, mo te hōtaka o te ahi nei, ko Harry Locke, TNA.
In a statement, NZ Bus says it wants the dispute settled as soon as possible and wants mediation to happen next week. It says it's also required to attend 3 days of litigation in the Employment Relations Authority next week that has been brought about by the union. NZ Bus maintains the offer on the table is good for all drivers and will help solve the driver shortage issues. Auckland Council is giving thousands of Kauri trees in the Waitakere Ranges a full health check. The forest is being surveyed to monitor trees for years to come, tracking how Kauri dieback disease affects individual trees and the wider population. Our reporter Katie Doyle and cameraman Dan Cook took a trip out to the ranges to see what it's all about.
It's peaceful up here in the Waitakere Ranges, but inside the bush a war rages on, the one against Kauri dieback. Now, in the latest attempt to stop the spread, Auckland Council is giving 3,500 random Kauri trees, healthy and unhealthy, a full checkup. The team manager for Kauri dieback, Lisa Tolich, explains.
That's giving us far more of a greater understanding of what's happening across the whole Kauri population. So if you're just focusing on one part of the population, i.e. those diseased trees, you're not really understanding how that disease is operating overall. So we want to understand a little bit more about prevalence of disease and how it associates with other risk factors or the impact of that disease within that broader ecosystem.
It's the third Kauri dieback survey rolled out by Auckland Council here since 2010. The first two mainly focused on finding where the pathogen that causes Kauri dieback was in the range's soil.
This third survey that we're doing, we're taking a different approach this time. We're wanting to understand more about the behaviour of the disease and the impacts of the disease. And the second element is we're really interested in understanding more about how successful the interventions like the track upgrade work, introduction of hygiene stations, the closures, the rahui themselves, have had on the spread of Kauri dieback disease.
That's where Frederick Jalm from Biosense comes in. He's one of the team tasked with surveying the trees, measuring their trunks and examining the soil below. All done after he's given his boots a thorough clean so the disease doesn't spread further.
It's a vast diversity of trees. We're trying to get all the aspects of the trees. So up on the ridges, down the valleys, large ones, small ones, to represent the population of Kauri.
Under no illusions, he knows the fight against Kauri dieback is not an easy one.
Well, I mean, as I said before, it's definitely worth fighting for.
That's echoed by Associate Professor Bruce Burns from the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Auckland. Warnings of dire consequences if Kauri aren't protected.
It almost selects the species that lives with it. And so if we take Kauri out of the system, then all those species that are dependent on it will also be lost. And there are a couple of species in there. There are some species that occur with Kauri, but they occur elsewhere. But there are some species that only occur with Kauri. And so we wouldn't just lose one species, we'd lose a whole suite of species if Kauri was lost.
What kind of species are those?
Well, one that I have a student working on at the moment is a greenhood orchid called Pterostylus agathicola, and that's only ever found under Kauri trees.
Taking care of the Kauri is a job for all, and Lisa Tolich says it's going to take a sustained effort.
The opportunity to eradicate the disease is well and truly past, so this is more about how we can focus on reducing the spread of the disease, but also how we can reduce the impact where the disease is.
For visitors to this lush battleground, that means sticking to the open tracks and scrubbing your shoes at every opportunity. For Checkpoint, Katie Doyle.
Quick bit of feedback before the news at 6. Clive from Napier South, this is around high-risk COVID countries. Clive reckons there's only 630 New Zealand citizens in India and not all of them want to come home. Not sure where the figure's from.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Good evening, I'm Marama Tipole. The National Party says it's pleased the government has finally listened to its calls for a risk-based approach to travellers arriving in the country. From the middle of next week, New Zealand residents in India, Brazil, Papua New Guinea and Pakistan will be barred from coming home. The move is expected to significantly reduce the risk of COVID-19 making it across the border. National's COVID-19 spokesperson Chris Bishop says the change is sensible.
The government's kind of belatedly got there. It's a good move. Maybe we should have been there, in January rather than late April.
The COVID-19 response minister has explained why the UK and the US are not deemed to be very high risk countries under the new rule, despite high numbers of COVID-19 cases in both countries. Chris Hipkins says countries fit the category if there have been more than 50 cases per 1,000 arrivals from them this year.
Despite the high reported case numbers in the US and the UK, where testing rates are also very high, travellers from these locations are about 10 times less likely to have COVID-19 when they arrive at the New Zealand border than someone coming from India, and 6 times less likely than someone coming from PNG, Pakistan or Brazil.
Only citizens, their partners and children, plus parents of citizens, will be allowed in from India, Pakistan, Brazil and Papua New Guinea. An abuse survivor says he's extremely uncomfortable about the government's change to the remit of the Royal Commission on Abuse and Care. The inquiry is tasked with examining the abuse of people in state and faith-based care between 1950 and 1999, but it was also given discretion to look outside that time period. That discretion has now been removed to ensure the Commission completes its work by 2023. Abuse survivor Keith Whiffen says it's shocking.
The two biggest things that survivors want from this process is acknowledgement and recognition as to what's happened historically to them and others, and to know that what happened to them is not going to happen to those who are in care now and who will go into care in the future.
Keith Whiffen says the change undermines what survivors want from the inquiry. A Whangarei woman has been sentenced to 10 months home detention for assaulting and neglecting her baby who later died. Earlier this year, the woman, whose name is suppressed, was found guilty of assaulting the 5-month-old. The boy, who died in August 2019, had received numerous injuries, including a skull fracture and fractured ribs. In the High Court in Whangarei today, Justice Van Bohemen said he accepted that the mother hit the child on the head with a shower head, but that did not cause his death. The Property Council says there's a strong case for amalgamating some local councils. The government today announced a 2-year independent review of every aspect of local government. The council's chief executive, Leonie Freeman, says amalgamation would simplify housing development.
We know in some areas of the country, developers can be working with 3 different councils within a 20-minute drive, and they all have different rules and regulations. So to enable a bit of standardisation allows for greater efficiency and less cost.
Leonie Freeman says the process was simplified in Auckland when councils there merged in 2010. The Green Party says a new kaupapa-centred program for Māori prisoners in Hawke's Bay is a welcome move but long overdue. The government today announced an overhaul of whānau services at Hawke's Bay Regional Prison today as part of a trial aimed at breaking the cycle of Māori reoffending. The Greens Māori Development spokesperson Elizabeth Kerekere says it's high time inmates had this kind of support through mātauranga and tikanga Māori. She says things must be done differently in all aspects of a system that consistently profiles Māori. It's 6:04. In sport, with just 1 win from 6 games, the Hurricanes know they're the also-rans of Super Rugby Aotearoa playoffs, but assistant coach Chris Gibbs says that doesn't mean that when they face the Chiefs in Hamilton tonight, there's nothing riding on the result. With just 2 games left before the final, the Chiefs are desperate to win to cement their second place in the standings. Gibbs says while the final may be beyond them, they have every reason to improve with the Trans-Tasman competition just around the corner.
When you look at the Blues performance, we went up there, we didn't fire a shot, we just didn't have the energy that the Hurricanes team normally has. So those, when you start talking about little things like that, not closing out that second half against the Chiefs, the season changes. So again, we're looking forward to be able to execute our game plan and play the way we want to for longer periods of time.
Chris Gibbs. The Silver Ferns captain, Amelia-Ann Ekenasio, is back training with the Pulse, indicating a return to play may not be far off. She hasn't played since the Constellation Cup in March and last week announced she was taking time out because of fatigue. Pulse coach Gail Parata says there is no time frame yet on when Ekenasio will be available to play in the ANZ Premiership. The defending champions, who were beaten by the Northern Stars in their opening game, take on the Magic in Hamilton on Sunday. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights on Friday Night Live, everything is ka pai from the Auckland Arts Festival in 2013. The Country Life team meet blacksmith Rob Pinkney, who's witnessed Forge After Forge closing. He's now offering blacksmithing classes in the hope the craft can be saved. And on the mixtape, David Attai from Nesian Mystic talks with Charlotte Ryan about his favourite music picks and about his passion for helping young musicians. That's Friday night with me, Karen Hay, in for Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Saturday. In the west from Northland to Taranaki, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and the central high country. Rain spreading southeast today with some possible thunderstorms, showers tomorrow. Whanganui to Wellington, cloudy, rain tonight, turning to showers tomorrow morning, but becoming fine in Wellington. Gisborne to Wairarapa, fine, but rain developing tomorrow morning with possible thunderstorms about Gisborne, then clearing south of Mahia by the afternoon. Marlborough and Nelson, rain, heavy and possibly thundery west of Takaka, spreading east today, cloudy periods tomorrow. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, rain with heavy falls and possible thunderstorms turning to showers tomorrow, some heavy. Canterbury, Central Otago, North Otago and Dunedin, high cloud, a few showers developing tomorrow. Clutha and Southland, scattered rain today and showers tomorrow. And for the Chatham Islands, fine spells, rain developing tomorrow morning. It's 6 minutes past 6. Good evening.
Thanks, Marama. No mai hoke mai. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. New Zealand residents in 4 COVID-ravaged countries will be barred from coming directly home under a new regime at the border. The rules are a relaxation of the complete travel ban on those arriving from India, but are a much stricter imposition on Pakistan, Brazil and Papua New Guinea. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
The news out of India is more dire by the day, a country in the grip of COVID-19.
India is being ravaged by a second wave.
314,000 new infections in a single day.
That breaks the global daily record that was set only yesterday.
New Zealand put in urgent suspension on all travel from India about 2 weeks ago. It expires Wednesday night. In its place will be a new regime. New Zealand citizens in India will be allowed back into the country. So will their partners and children. So will any parents of children who are citizens. But for everyone else, including permanent residents, the ban remains.
I don't underestimate how difficult travel restrictions have been for New Zealanders around the world over the last year. This adds another group of people whose travel will potentially be disrupted.
And the new restrictions won't just apply to India. The COVID-19 Response Minister Chris Hipkins today outlined a new category of country deemed very high risk. They're countries which have been leaking COVID-19. For every 1,000 people leaving them and then arriving in New Zealand, more than 50 have the virus.
Initially, India, Brazil, Papua New Guinea and Pakistan are the countries that meet this threshold.
The tougher rules are expected to significantly reduce the number of cases making it across the border, an estimated 75% from India alone. The only way New Zealand residents in those 4 nations will be allowed in is if they first spend 14 days in a lower risk country, or if they apply for an exception on humanitarian grounds.
I want to stress that this was not an easy decision to make, and we do recognise that this will have a significant impact on a number of people. This decision's been based entirely on a risk assessment, and it will be regularly reviewed.
Paul Patel is the president of New Zealand's Indian Central Association. He says the restrictions are reasonable given the pandemic.
We're not just protecting those that are coming into the country, we're actually protecting managed isolation facilities. That there is a risk at that point there.
Such measures have long been called for by the opposition National Party and by epidemiologists such as Michael Baker. They've advocated for a traffic light system. Professor Baker says that's basically where the government has landed.
We've got the real red zone countries, as mentioned here. If you like, there could be an amber zone, which is the rest of the world. And of course, we've now got a green zone with Australia, where there's quarantine-free travel. This is a huge shift in our policies here for managing risk, and it's a very positive development.
National's COVID-19 spokesperson Chris Bishop agrees. He just wishes it came a bit earlier.
The government's kind of belatedly got there. It's a good move. Maybe we should have been there, in January rather than late April.
The new regime applies from Thursday on. Next month, the government will provide an update on the process for moving countries in and out of that highest risk category. Atu iti whare parimata, mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Craig McCulloch.
The government's also changing the way it handles managed isolation hotels, with returnees now set to be grouped together depending on when they arrive. Under the new rules, anyone arriving in a 96-hour window will be taken to the same hotel. Now, once that hotel is full or the time period is up, the facility will lock down for 14 days with no new returnees allowed in until the last cohort's left and the hotel's been cleaned. Well, joining us now to discuss these changes and the red zoning of countries is Professor Kurt Krauss, who's an infectious disease physician who teaches biochemistry at the University of Otago. Kia ora, Professor. This cohorting, do you think it goes far enough? It's centred around times of arrivals rather than countries of departure. Can you hear me, Professor? I think we might have a few problems with sound there, so hopefully we'll get back to Professor Kurt Krauss to discuss those changes at MIQ. But in the meantime, let's go on to another government announcement that was made today. The government is planning to give local government the biggest overhaul in decades. The Minister, Nanaia Mahuta, today announced an independent review which will determine the future of the sector for the next 25 to 30 years. Local government leaders say changes are needed, but the opposition is worried the review could lead to an amalgamation of councils. Political reporter Charlie Drever was at the launch in Lower Hutt today and she filed this report.
Local councils have been plagued with stories of crumbling infrastructure, unaffordable housing and dreaded rates increases for years. The stakes are high for local government Minister Nanaia Mahuta to get the review and the subsequent changes right.
If there's nothing else that I do as Minister of Local Government, it will be this.
The Minister says the review will shape local government for the next generation.
The review I'm announcing today will comprehensively consider what local government does, how it does it, and how it pays for it. A very important question to be answered.
Local government President Stuart Crosby says over the last 30 years, more and more responsibilities have been put on councils, but it's been siloed.
If I could look ahead for a vision, I could see both sectors of government actually working together in reality, particularly in the delivery space, through a whole range of activities, more effectively, more efficiently, ultimately serving the current and future generations of this country.
Hutt City Mayor Campbell Barry says councils can't continue for the next 30 years with the current mechanisms in place.
We have the constant battle in local government as councils of expectations to keep rates low, or that's usually a difficult conversation to have, but also the mounting pressures on infrastructure and need in the community. And we simply don't have, particularly when it comes to funding, many mechanisms to be able to deal with that.
He says it's not just about funding, but looking at delivering services differently, for example, through partnerships with iwi and other groups. The review panel will be speaking to councils, iwi, communities and other stakeholders from next month. Its scope for the review will be local government's roles, functions and partnerships, representation, governance, funding and financing. Its chair, Jim Palmer, says this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance to make a difference.
We know we're not going to please everybody all the time, but ensuring that we've been able to demonstrate that we've listened, understood the concerns of communities and all of the interested parties, of which there are many, making sure that those views have been taken into account and genuinely considered.
The review will take place over 2 years, which Nanaia Mahuta says will allow it to take into account Three Waters and RMA reforms, which will also impact the sector. The report is due back in April 2023, just months before the general election, but she's confident changes can get across the line. National's local government spokesperson Christopher Luxon is supportive of the review, as long as it isn't used as an excuse for centralisation or taking power away from ratepayers.
This government, I think, is increasingly taking a we know best, Wellington knows best, and sort of building central bureaucracy. And we've seen that whether it's charter schools or polytechnics, DHBs, and I don't think that's appropriate that we go down that road with local government.
He's hoping this will be a broad review of local government into the 2040s. Rather than band-aiding the current 1980 system, he says is fundamentally broken. An interim report on the direction of the review is due to be delivered in September. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Ko Charlie Drever, DNA.
Right, let's go back to our earlier story, and this is on the changes that the government is making to MIQ. Basically, what they're going to do is cluster returnees together. Now, under the new rules, people arriving within 96 hours in this window, they'll be taken to the same hotel, right? When that hotel fills up, or the time period clicks over from the 96 hours, they'll lock down the hotel. Nobody leaves there until the last person completes their... nobody goes in, rather, until the last person completes their managed isolation. So, to discuss these changes, we're joined now by Professor Kurt Kraus, who's an infectious disease physician, and he also teaches biochemistry at the University of Otago. Professor, this cohorting, as they call it, is based on your time of arrival, right? Do you think that's the best way to do it?
Okay, well, it's a compromise, right? I mean, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little bit nervous about opening travel up to a country that has a severe problem with COVID. And I think it's a little scary probably for everybody, but it's also a bit of a compromise. I mean, we know we've got New Zealand citizens who need to come back and we can't keep them out indefinitely. So I have to say I think it's actually pretty clever because it's cohorting the group of people who have arrived at the same time together. It minimizes the crosstalk from them to other people who they might encounter if there's people leaving and coming in constantly during their stay, and then they kind of leave together. So I think it's a clever compromise solution to what is a really difficult problem, because the other alternative is we just sort of close the doors completely.
The thing is, though, you are putting people together who could arrive from, well, they're arriving from these very high-risk countries. Let's just use India as the example. So a plane comes in from India, right? And you get someone else flying in from Singapore or someone else flying in from London at the same time. Yeah. All those people are grouped together. Would the best-case scenario be grouping only high-risk arrivals together and keeping other countries separate?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the cons, so the pro, as I mentioned, it restricts the risk to a cohort that's arriving about the same time. The con is, if you're coming from a low-risk country, you're almost certainly going to be exposed to, or you're more likely to be exposed to somebody who actually has COVID. So it's tricky, right? Because do you have enough planes coming from India where you can fill up just hotels from people from India, hotels of people from Pakistan? I don't think so, and the logistics of that would be a bit of a nightmare. So I think you put people on notice that when you're here, you want to be really careful about social distancing, wearing your mask, doing everything that you can to make sure you minimize risk. One thing they could consider doing, well, there are two things I wondered about. I wondered, this is a big change, would it make sense to roll it out and trial it for 2 weeks before opening up the border? That was an idea that I had.
Professor, sorry to interrupt, you mean trial the whole concept of cohorting without arrivals from these high-risk countries, practice your procedures first?
Yeah, well, we've seen, a frequent thing that we've seen is something goes on at MIQ, it's a new idea, and then after a few weeks, we realize there's some fish hooks that we hadn't envisaged, right? So if you try it first, then you're going to sort those fish hooks out. So that's one thing that I thought. And the other thing that I'm wondering about is whether it would make sense to for people to be somewhat more restricted in terms of whether they need, I'm not sure about restricting them to the room, but a little more interaction restriction until they get that third day test.
So the rules around that in the moment, day 0, you got to stay in your room, day 1, day 0 test until you get the result. After that, you're free to move around. And the Minister today doesn't seem to have any plans to change that. And no staying in your room at the day 12 test either. Exercise is still on the cards, smoke breaks still on the cards, and there doesn't seem to be a commitment to getting rid of bus rides to exercise as well. Are you comfortable with keeping that regime as it is?
I think it's sort of a line. I'm sorry, my screen froze, and now I'm talking to you on my telephone. I don't know if it's...
No problem. I've got you, Professor. Great. So there's no real plans to change that regime in MIQ around exercise, allowing people to have smoke breaks, or even busing to other locations to have a walkabout. I mean, are you comfortable with that, or would you go a bit further?
Yeah, if it were, it's an interesting question, because if I were in charge and I was, could snap my fingers, I would say, let's vaccinate the entire population. You look at the United States, which had a very difficult period last year. Now they're vaccinating 3 million people a day. I'd like to get 2 days of that, please, and then have New Zealand completely taken care of. Given that we can't do that, we've got compromises, and I think this is a fair and reasonable compromise. We know that masks and hand hygiene and social distancing are good. We know that these PCR tests are very effective. So I guess I'm cautiously optimistic that it's going to work and we're not going to see a problem. But let's just be really, really careful during this period, because we're actually in an incredibly good position in New Zealand, right? We don't have any transmission in the community, and we know that it's just a border incursion away, and we know that it grows exponentially. So whatever we do, we don't want to lose this advantage that we have. And having said all that and being cautious, I'm pretty happy with what the government's put in place.
Right, so in terms of that, being cautious, the 4 countries that have been classified as very high risk, Pakistan, PNG, Brazil and India, are those the countries that you would have chosen?
Yes, I think so. In terms of the degree of acceleration and what's going on with their number of daily cases, they're quite high. The absolute numbers in PNG are not that high, but the numbers in India are shockingly high. The slope of the increase in cases each day in India is just really quite remarkable. It's also true that India has a new variant that you may have heard. It's 617, 618, which came out of West Bengal, which seemed to combine some of the changes we've seen in the UK variant and some that we've seen in the South African variant and in the Brazil variant. So the virus is continuing to mutate, which viruses do. They change when they're under selection pressure. The virus continues to change and becomes more likely to be transmitted. And this will go on until the pandemic begins to diminish.
Are there any other countries that you would add to that very high risk list?
Looking at it's a tough one. Not right now. I mean, France has had an increased outbreak, but those numbers are settling down, and same with Italy. UK is looking kind of good. I think you just have to be vigilant and watch the numbers, and the whole situation is very fluid.
Appreciate you joining us this evening. That is Professor Kurt Krauss, who's an infectious disease physician. It is 23 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. President Joe Biden has set an ambitious goal, pledging to cut US greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. Mr. Biden made the pitch during a climate summit where he had the attention of leaders from around the world, including China and Russia, putting pressure on those countries to follow suit. CNN's Caitlin Collins reports.
We really have no choice. We have to get this done.
With a sense of urgency, the U.S. is setting its sights on an ambitious new climate goal this Earth Day.
This is the decisive decade. This is the decade we must make decisions that will avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis.
President Biden is pledging to cut greenhouse gas emissions in at least half by the end of the decade, almost doubling the goal set by former President Obama. The new goal for fossil fuel use would transform almost every sector of the American economy and could set the stage for a partisan showdown.
When people talk about climate, I think jobs. Within our climate response lies an extraordinary engine of job creation.
Biden's pledge is a sharp 180 from his predecessor, who often denied science and defiantly walked away from the Paris Climate Accords.
A very unfair act for the United States. The Paris Accord was not designed to save the environment. It was designed to kill the American economy.
Biden rejoined the Paris Climate Accords on his first day in office and promised to reverse Trump's policies, moves that world leaders welcomed today.
I'm delighted to see that the United States is back to work together with us in climate politics.
I'm really thrilled by the game-changing announcement that Joe Biden has just made.
As the president tries to reestablish America on the world climate stage, he'll have to reassure skeptics, something his climate envoy John Kauri acknowledged today.
First question out of people's mouths was, what's your NDC going to be? What are you guys going to do? You've destroyed your credibility. You've left the Paris Agreement. How can we trust you? What's going to happen in the next 4 years?
Biden is convening dozens of world leaders virtually, including those he's recently clashed with, like Chinese President Xi Jinping.
The environment concerns the well-being of people in all countries.
And that report was by Caitlin Collins. Australians in India are panicking after the government announced a cut in arrivals from the COVID hotspot country as it tries to stem the growing number of infections in hotel quarantine. The ABC's James Oaten reports.
Melburnian Deborah Pacheco has been watching the events unfold in India with grave concern.
A lot of people who have died, family and friends, from this disease, and we're hearing something every day. So it's really disheartening. You're so nervous to look at your phone when there's a message that beeps from someone who you haven't heard from in a while.
She arrived last November with her husband and 2 young children to spend some time with her family in Goa. But as the COVID crisis unfolded around her and across the country, Deborah was keen to get the family back home. She secured tickets for next month. But now those plans are uncertain.
It's disheartening because we waited for so long to get on flights. Just the competition is crazy. There's a minimum amount of flights. We wait for ages to let it get confirmed. The DFAT flights are affordable and we were really lucky to get on board, or so we thought. But now, unfortunately, we just have to wait and see whether we can actually make that flight.
There's an overwhelming sense of gloom and despair in India. There are countless stories of desperate people unable to get medical attention or people dying after being turned away from hospitals.
I think I describe it as a country that is broken. Everywhere what I sense is a kind of cocktail of rage, despair, devastation, loss and helplessness.
That's journalist Barker Dutt, who spent weeks reporting at hospitals and cremation sites. Her elderly father's just been admitted to intensive care after contracting the virus.
It's heartbreaking. What's happening is larger than us, right? It's a calamity, like being at war. And I just feel like I have to keep telling this story. I have to keep holding power to account. And also, it's the only way I know how to cope.
India's daily infection rate of almost 315,000 cases is a new global record. Poor COVID behaviour is widely blamed for igniting the surge, which has included large political gatherings and religious festivals. Then the more infectious variants are believed to be fueling the fire.
And that report was by the ABC's James Oaten. The British Secret Services have always been shrouded in mystique and secrecy, so it's probably surprising that MI5, the UK's domestic intelligence service, has joined Instagram. As the BBC's Charlotte Gallagher reports, it's hoping to bust myths and attract new recruits.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
The most famous and fictional member of the British Secret Services, and James Bond's womanising, tuxedo-wearing and martini-drinking ways are part of the reason why MI5 has decided it's time to join Instagram. Its Director General, Ken McCallum, said it was time to cast off the stereotypes, including the shaken not stirred catchphrase. So far, it's shared one photo, the view its staff get when they walk through the doors of the headquarters Thames House. The caption reads that the secret to successful spying is to consider all angles. MI5 says it plans to show what it's like to be an agent and surveillance officer, but added that missions won't become an open book. It's not the first Secret Service to join the social media platform. The CIA in the US has more than 3 million followers and shares information about the agency, as well as things you probably wouldn't expect, like dogs in fancy dress. Israel's Mossad is on there too. All three use their accounts to attract the spies of the future, people that might never have thought to apply. Urging people to follow the MI5 account, Ken McCallum said, "You can insert your own joke about whether we will be following you."
And that was Charlotte Gallagher reporting. We'll be checking out that Instagram account. Hey, thanks for joining us this evening. Don't forget that you can check out all our videos online. We'll be back Tuesday.
Thanks, Lisa. RNZ News headlines at 6:30. India has recorded the world's highest daily number of coronavirus cases for the second day in a row and a record number of daily deaths from COVID-19. The figures come on the same day this country's government announced New Zealand